The sky was the color of frozen steel. April 17, 1943, 0542 hours. A cold wind swept across the airfield in East Anglia, carrying the scent of kerosene and morning frost. Beneath the dim light of the hangar lamps, the crew of Lancaster, Victor, King, moved with quiet precision, boots crunching on gravel, breath misting in the half-light. Arthur, Ash, Lenton stood apart from the others, gloved hands resting on the cold fuselage. 24 years old, an engineer by instinct more than training. He had a habit of listening to machines as if they spoke. And that morning, the bomber hummed faintly under his palm, alive, ready, and unknowingly doomed. The target was a munitions depot beyond the roar. A deep run through the most heavily defended skies in Europe. For hours, Ash had gone over every circuit, every fuse, every whisper of current that ran through the bomber's heart. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet as the engines roared to life and the crew strapped in, a pulse of unease rippled through him, a sense that something, somewhere, wasn't right. By the time they cleared the coast, dawn had turned to grey. The world below was nothing but fog and shadow. Ash sat behind the pilot, eyes flicking across the instruments. The altimeter held steady. The gyros hummed softly. Everything worked for now. Course steady, fuel flow nominal. The pilot, Captain Weller, muttered through the intercom. Ash nodded, eyes still on the dials. Roger that. The hum of 4 Merlin engines filled the cabin, a mechanical symphony that soothed even the most anxious heart. Then, a flicker. The needle on the left engine's power gauge twitched. Once, twice. Ash leaned forward, frowning. A second later, the cabin lights dimmed. Power fluctuation, he said, half to himself. His hands moved automatically, flipping toggles, checking resistors. The pilot's voice cut through the hum. We've lost number 2. Not yet. But something's feeding back through the main. Keep an eye on it. He did more than that. He listened to the faint, irregular heartbeat of the circuits, the way the hum faltered, as though something deep inside the bomber's veins was shorting out. Minutes passed. Outside, the horizon lit up. German flak blooming in the distance like dark flowers. The crew tensed as tracer lines streaked the clouds. Then, all at once, the lights inside went dead. The cockpit plunged into darkness. Only the pale glow of the sky bled through the windows. Ash felt his stomach drop. We've lost internal electrics. Radio 2, said the navigator. I've got nothing. Hydraulics holding. For now. Ash ripped off his harness and moved toward the access panel behind the flight deck. The smell of burnt insulation hit him first, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. A wire had blown. Get us level, he shouted. I'll find it. He unlatched the floor plate and shone a small inspection lamp into the narrow crawl space. The light flickered against cables, pipes, and rivets. He could hear the faint hiss of something shorting, a dangerous whisper. Somewhere between the main bus and the engine control feed, a surge had burned through the wiring harness. But the location, buried beneath the control column, was unreachable in flight. The intercom crackled with static, then died completely. Only the roar of the engines remained, pounding through the cabin like a heartbeat. Ash turned back toward the pilot. We're running blind. Weller's jaw clenched. Can you fix it? Not unless you can stop time. They exchanged a look, no words needed. Below them stretched miles of occupied territory. Turning back wasn't an option. Ash took a breath, forcing calm through the rising panic. He'd studied every inch of this machine, memorized the way current flowed from the generators to the vital systems. But now, with the main conduit gone, power had nowhere to go. Instruments would fail one by one. First navigation, then hydraulics, then ignition control. Once that happened, they'd be falling metal. He pressed a hand against the cold metal of the bulkhead. Somewhere beneath his fingers, 1,000 wires pulsed with residual charge. He closed his eyes and tried to visualize the path, generator to bus, bus to transformer, transformer to relay. Somewhere between relay and output, the current died. He opened his eyes to the darkness. There's a short deep in the main line, he said finally. We're going to lose more systems soon. The navigator cursed. Then what the hell do we do? Ash didn't answer. He didn't know yet. A distant thud shook the airframe. Flack. Then another closer. Metal rang under impact. Someone shouted in the rear turret, a hit on the wing. Smoke began curling through the fuselage, black and bitter. "Stay on course," the captain yelled. Ash braced himself against the vibration, gripping the frame as the bomber shuddered. Sparks danced near his feet, brief and bright. The smell of ozone filled the cabin. He yanked open a side panel and traced the wire bundle with his gloved hand. His fingertips brushed a section that was warm, too warm. The insulation had melted through. A flash of realization hit him like ice. The fault wasn't just in the panel, it was spreading through the system like fire in veins. "Kill the secondary line!" he shouted. "Which one?" "All of them." The lights blinked out completely. For a moment, the crew sat in total darkness. Only the red glow of burning flak outside painting their faces. Ash's breath came slow and measured. "Okay," he murmured. "Now we see what's left." One by one. The gauges flickered back to life, dim, unstable. Enough to fly by, barely. But the damage was done. The radio was gone. The targeting system was gone. And most dangerously of all, the trim control had seized. The bomber began to list, nose dipping. "Hold her steady!" Weller grunted, pulling the yoke hard. The aircraft groaned like a living thing in pain. "She's fighting me." Manual override. Ash shook his head. Hydraulic assist is tied to the same feed. For a moment, all he could hear was the engine roar, the wind clawing at the fuselage, and the quiet breathing of men realizing how close they were to dying. He crawled back toward the hatch and stared at the maze of wires once more. His mind worked in silence, picturing the layout, recalling the schematics, hearing the current like a pulse in his skull. If he could just reroute power, if he could find a way to bypass the burned section, but the location of the fault was impossible. Deep under the reinforced column, behind layers of armored casing, even on the ground it would take hours. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking. Outside, flak continued to blossom in black clouds. A near miss rocked the bomber sideways, sending loose gear clattering across the deck. Ash was thrown against the wall. His shoulder burned, but he barely felt it. He looked out the side window, the horizon tilted, the world inverted. "Level it out!" "I'm trying." Weller's voice was hoarse. "Controls are stiff as hell." Ash's mind screamed for a solution, any solution. But the rational part of him whispered what he didn't want to hear. There wasn't one. He sat there, breathing in smoke and fear, the metal around him trembling like a wounded beast. For the first time since the war began, Arthur Lenton felt helpless. He looked down at his hands, steady, capable, but useless now. The power that once hummed through the bomber was gone, and with it, the fragile thread that held them aloft. The altimeter ticked downward, 9,000 feet, 8,700. Ash closed his eyes and imagined the circuits again, the wires, the flow of electricity. He could see it, a river of light cut by a single dark gap. If only he could reach it. He opened his eyes. A faint spark danced near his boots, static discharge. His brain latched onto it like a lifeline. Current still lived somewhere in this dying beast. Maybe there was a way. He looked toward the cockpit, where the pilot wrestled with the yoke. "Hold her steady," Ash said quietly. "Whatever happens, don't let her roll." "What are you thinking?" "Nothing yet." He hesitated. "But I might soon." He turned back toward the darkness of the wiring bay. The smell of oil, sweat, and burnt copper thickened the air. His flashlight flickered, then steadied. He crawled deeper into the shadows, into the humming heart of the crippled bomber, where hope and reason no longer belonged, only instinct. And as the altimeter continued to fall, the sound of his breath merged with the soft electric hiss of dying circuits, the heartbeat of a machine waiting for a miracle. Ash moved deeper into the fuselage, the flashlight beam cutting through smoke. The air was thick with cold and oil, every breath carried the taste of metal. He crawled beneath the cables, past the oxygen line, where the heat from the engines made the walls tremble like skin under strain. Somewhere ahead, the faint hum of dying current pulsed through the ship's bones. He reached the junction box and flipped it open. The circuits inside were blackened and fused. The insulation burned to ash. A small arc hissed when he brushed a loose wire. It was still alive, but barely. He could almost feel it pleading, as if the plane itself wanted to keep fighting. "Captain," He called over his shoulder, voice muffled by the roar. We've lost the primary conduit. But there's still residual current in the auxiliary feed. Weller's voice came back, strained and distant. Can you isolate it? I can try. But I'll need to kill the bus completely first. Do it. Ash took a steadying breath and reached for the main cutoff. The bomber went dark again. Engines still thundering in the void like caged beasts. He could hear nothing but the vibration through the metal, deep, rhythmic, alive. He traced the burned section with his fingertips, feeling the story it told, one pulse too strong, one surge that lipped the insulation and turned copper to charcoal. It was beautiful in a way, the fragile precision of human design undone by the brutality of war. He closed his eyes and thought. Each circuit had a twin, a mirrored path for redundancy. If he could reroute through one of the secondary lines, he might restore partial control. But the challenge was physical. The line he needed ran beneath the armored column that carried the control cables. There was no access point. Still, he stared at the metal as if willing it to surrender a secret. Behind him, someone shouted, "Fighters! 2 o'clock high!" The sound of gunfire erupted, staccato bursts. Metal against sky. The bomber jolted as tracers cut through the air around them. Ash gritted his teeth and worked faster. Sparks spat from the edge of the panel, stinging his gloves. The flashlight beam shook with the tremor of cannon fire. "Hold her steady!" he yelled. "She's bleeding speed!" Weller shouted back. "Get me something!" I couldn't think about altitude or flak, or the gunners screaming in the rear turret. The world had narrowed to a handful of frayed wires and the cold determination in his chest. He tore a strip from the insulation wrap and twisted it around a bare section of copper. The contact hissed, flared, then dimmed to a weak orange glow. A pulse of current flowed, faint but real. "Come on," he whispered. "Talk to me." The panel trembled beneath his hands. One of the gauges on the flight deck flickered to life, a heartbeat returning after a near death. "Navigator," Weller barked. "Raiding anything?" "Compass coming back online partial!" Ash allowed himself a single breath of relief. It wasn't much, but it meant the bomber was still listening, still fighting. He ducked lower, pushing his arm deeper into the tangle of wires. The heat was rising now. The metal casing around the conduit glowed faintly from the friction of energy trying to escape. The bomber lurched again. Something exploded outside. One of the gunners screaming through the intercom, port engine hit. Ash felt the plane roll violently to the left. His head slammed against the frame, stars bursting behind his eyes. "Level her out!" he shouted. "Trying! Controls are heavy!" He forced himself upright, the world spinning. If he didn't stabilize power soon, they'd lose hydraulics completely. The pilot wouldn't be able to pull them out of the dive. He stared at the auxiliary line again. A thought formed, reckless, dangerous, maybe insane. But it was all they had. He unclipped the grounding strap from his tool belt and stripped the rubber end with his teeth. Sparks nipped at his fingers as he attached the bare wire to the terminal. He needed a second contact, something conductive. His gaze darted around the cabin, landing on a loose metal pin lying near his boot. It would have to do. He jammed the pin into the second socket and held his breath. The circuit hummed. The faint whine of energy moved through the line, fragile but present. "Try controls now," he yelled. Weller pulled hard on the yoke. The bomber groaned, but this time it responded. Slowly, stubbornly, the nose began to rise. "Altitude stabilizing!" the navigator shouted. A cheer rippled through the intercom, but Ash barely heard it. His hands trembled from the voltage dancing through the wires. He could smell the faint sweetness of heated metal, feel the vibration crawl up his arms. "Easy," he whispered. "Stay with Mim." For a moment, everything held. Then another surge. A flash of blue-white light burst from the panel, scorching his glove. He recoiled, hitting his shoulder against the bulkhead. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. "Power dropping again!" the navigator cried. Ash coughed through the smoke, forcing himself upright. "It's fluctuating through the return path. The main line's drawing it out." He needed a bypass. Something to jump the current past the dead section entirely. But there was no time to design, no tools fine enough for the job. Just raw instinct and a mind that refused to quit. He yanked another piece of wire from a nearby housing and stripped it bare. The bomber tilted again, throwing him sideways. His flashlight clattered out of reach, spinning light across the walls like a frantic heartbeat. "Come on," he hissed, clawing toward it. His gloves slipped on oil and sweat. He grabbed the lamp, wedged it between his knees, and began twisting the wires together in the dark. His pulse matched the rhythm of the engines, fast, uneven, alive. The cable sparked again, and for one blinding moment, he saw everything, the flicker of power dancing through his makeshift repair, the faint hum of life returning to the ship. He slammed the panel shut and hit the master switch. The cockpit lights blinked, then steadied. One by one, gauges came alive, the altimeter, the fuel pressure, the horizon indicator. "It's back!" the navigator shouted. Weller's voice cracked with disbelief. "Ash, whatever you did, it's working!" Ash slumped against the wall, chest heaving. His eyes burned from smoke. He looked down at his trembling hands, blackened with soot. The bomber held steady now, engines roaring in perfect rhythm once again. But deep in his gut, he knew it was only temporary. The fix wasn't stable. The burned section was still buried beneath the column, a wound patched, not healed. He forced himself to his feet and peered toward the cockpit. "You've got maybe 20 minutes before it goes again," he said quietly. "Then let's make them count." Outside, the clouds began to thin. Through the smoke-streaked windows, Ash could see the pale horizon glowing with distant sunlight. The night was ending, but their fight was far from over. He sat back against the bulkhead, the vibration of the engines thrumming through his spine. In that rhythmic hum, he could almost hear a message, not from the machine, but from fate itself. "You're not finished yet." And somewhere deep within the bomber's wounded circuits, a faint electric pulse answered, fragile, stubborn, alive. The bomber trembled like a wounded animal caught between life and gravity. Smoke curled along the seams of the fuselage, drawn toward the cold drafts that hissed through bullet holes in the metal. The air inside was sharp, electric, full of static charge and fear. Ash sat slumped against the bulkhead, every nerve still singing from the current he'd bridged minutes before. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Around him, the faint hum of restored power pulsed like a heartbeat struggling to stay alive. Altitude steady at 6,000. Weller called, his voice hoarse over the intercom. "She's holding for now." Ash forced a nod, though no one could see him. "Copy that." But he could already feel it. A vibration that didn't belong. A tremor deep in the belly of the plane, subtle at first, like a whisper through the frame. It was the sound of power bleeding somewhere unseen. He reached up and touched the side panel hot. Too hot. His heart sank. The makeshift bypass was starting to fail. Outside, the clouds broke apart, revealing the blackened earth below, enemy territory. Towns lay in silence under the thin grey dawn, dotted with flares of orange, where the night's bombing runs still burned. The crew said nothing. Each man knew how far they were from home. "Navigator position," Weller asked. "Halfway to the Ra. Winds are shifting. We're drifting south. Correct it manually." No autopilot. Ash knew why. The electrical feed for autopilot had burned out entirely. Every correction now had to come from human hands. He unstrapped himself and moved toward the rear compartment, boots echoing hollow against the floor. The light flickered above him, faint, sickly. He pressed his palm against the wall as he passed, listening again. The plane spoke in creaks and groans, its language one only he could hear. He crouched near the auxiliary line he'd rigged earlier. The insulation was glowing faintly, a sign of strain. The copper inside was heating from the overload. One more surge, and it would melt clean through. He exhaled slowly. "Come on, girl. Just a little longer." Then, a jolt. A deafening crack split the air, followed by the stench of burnt ozone. The cabin lights exploded in a shower of sparks. "Power loss again!" shouted the navigator. "I see it!" Ash yelled, diving toward the panel. His hands worked instinctively, tearing the casing open. Inside, one of the junctions had arced, welding itself to the frame. The wire was now fused solid, no conductivity left. Hydraulics dropping, Weller barked. "I can barely keep her level? Give me a minute!" Ash's fingers dug through the tangle of scorched cable, ignoring the heat biting through his gloves. Every second, the vibration worsened. The right wing dipped lower, loose shells rolled across the floor. He found the fault, a melted bridge wire. He reached for his tool pouch, but half the contents had spilled during the last hit. Only fragments remained: a wrench, a pair of cutters, and a scrap of aluminum from the panel housing. He could hear Weller shouting something, but the roar drowned it out. The engine strained, sputtering on uneven power. Ash clenched his jaw. He tore a strip of wire from a dead circuit nearby and twisted it into a crude loop. Then he wedged the aluminum scrap against the live terminal, completing a temporary bridge. A sharp spark jumped, white and blinding. He felt the burn across his knuckles but didn't pull away. The vibration eased slightly. "Voltage stabilizing," he said through gritted teeth. "Hydraulics responding," came the pilot's reply. Ash exhaled, his lungs aching. The cabin dimmed, then brightened again as power returned. The relief lasted only a moment before another sound broke through, a high-pitched whine. "Radio's gone," the navigator said quietly, "completely dead." That meant they were alone now, invisible, unreachable. If they went down, no one would know where. Ash stared at the smoking panel, the aluminum patch glowing orange at the edges. It wouldn't last, he knew it. Every fix was buying them minutes, maybe less. He sat back, head resting against the cold metal behind him. His ears rang with the echo of the spark. Through the small window near his shoulder, he could see the horizon flickering with distant anti-aircraft bursts. It looked like lightning frozen in the clouds. He thought of home, the workshop behind his father's shed, the smell of oil and pine dust. The old radio he'd built as a boy, wires twisted together by hand. He'd learned something then: every current wants to return to ground. And every man, no matter how far he flies, wants to do the same. A violent shudder ripped through the bomber. A shell exploded close off the right wing, showering the glass with fragments. The gunner screamed through the intercom, "We've got fighters on us!" Weller's voice cut through the chaos. "Ash, I need everything you can give me!" Ash looked at the smoking patch, the red glow dimming under stress. He felt the aircraft tilt again, the engines fighting imbalance. His mind raced, mapping invisible paths through the machine. He could see it in his head, the dead main feed, the auxiliary struggling, the fragile bridge flickering like a dying flame. Somewhere there had to be a third option. He stared at the ceiling. Above the navigation bay ran another set of circuits. One's designed for non-essential systems: lights, heating, the electrical trim motor. Useless in battle but still alive. A plan began to form. He crawled toward the overhead panel, ripped open the maintenance hatch, and scanned the mess of wires. Each was color-coded: red for live, green for return, blue for auxiliary. He traced the blue line with his eyes, following it toward the central conduit. If he rerouted it, he could feed partial voltage to the flight controls, enough to stabilize. But it would mean killing all cabin systems permanently. Lights, heat, oxygen circulation gone. The crew would freeze. He looked back toward the cockpit. Weller met his eyes for a moment, the question unspoken. Ash nodded once. "Do it," Weller said quietly. He cut the blue line. The light above flickered and died. A chill filled the bomber as the ventilation shut off. The only sound left was the thundering engines and the faint whimper of wind. He spliced the blue wire into the auxiliary bus, twisting it tight, sparks crackling in the dark. The deck lights glowed once, then faded to black. The current shifted, redirected into the control feed. Weller pulled the yoke again. This time it moved smooth and clean. "She's responsive!" he shouted. Ash leaned back against the wall, exhausted. Then keep her that way. For a brief moment there was calm. The bomber leveled out, engines harmonized, and the crew dared to breathe. But Ash knew calm in war was always temporary, a fragile illusion before the next storm. He wiped soot from his face, his gloves streaked black. His eyes stung from smoke. The cabin was freezing now, frost already forming near the seams. He stared at the faint glow of the instruments, half alive on borrowed power, and realized something unsettling. The more he fixed, the more the plane depended on him. It was no longer just a machine. It was a dying creature, kept alive by his will alone. He looked down at his burned hands, then at the trembling light on the console, and whispered under his breath not a prayer, but a promise. "Stay with me." Outside. The wind screamed across the wings, dragging the sound into the endless grey. And deep inside the bomber, the pulse of failing electricity matched the rhythm of a man's resolve, fragile, fading, but unbroken. The cold crept in first. It came through the seams, over the floor, into the bones of every man aboard. Without the heaters, the temperature dropped fast, freezing the sweat on their faces into glassy trails. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. Ash sat near the electrical panel, his coat open, his gloves burned through. His eyes stayed locked on the flickering voltmeter needle, watching it dance like a nervous pulse. Each vibration, each sway of the bomber, felt amplified in the silence between engine roars. The intercom crackled once, then went quiet again, dead line, dead air. The crew was now communicating through gestures and shouting. Every word was eaten by the wind. Ash pressed a hand to the wall, feeling the rhythm. The engines were losing balance. Number 3 was over, revving to compensate. He looked toward the cockpit. Weller's silhouette leaning into the yoke, muscles rigid, eyes forward. The man had been flying for 6 years, but never like this. The bomber dipped, nose down. Ash lurched forward, catching himself against a bulkhead. "You're losing altitude!" he shouted. "I know!" Weller yelled back. "Trim's failing again!" Ash stumbled toward the front, gripping whatever he could find. His boots slipped on frost gathering near the floor. He crouched beside the control column, shining his flashlight beneath it, the very place he'd dreaded since the beginning. The fault line ran beneath that steel casing, unreachable, untouchable. He stared at it for a long moment. The smell of burning metal still lingered. Then, softly, he whispered, "That's where you're hiding, isn't it?" He could almost feel the current beneath the casing, the wounded heart of the machine beating unevenly. The bomber wasn't dying. It was crying out. He turned to Weller. "I can fix it." The captain's eyes flicked toward him. "Not in midair, you can't." Ash's voice steadied, low but certain. "If I can reroute from the lower grid, I can bypass the column. But I'll need to cut power again. You do that, we lose everything. Controls, hydraulics, lights, all of it." Ash nodded. "Then you'll have to fly blind for 30 seconds. For a long moment." Weller said nothing. Then he exhaled through his teeth. "Do it." Ash moved fast. He grabbed his tool pouch and dropped to his knees near the main feed. His fingers were numb from cold, but his mind burned hot with calculation. Each motion was measured. Every breath timed with the rhythm of the engines. He pulled the circuit breaker. The bomber went dark, total black. The sound of the engines was all that remained. Hollow and distant, as though they were flying inside a ghost. He yanked open the lower panel and plunged his hands inside. The cables hissed faintly, still carrying residual charge. The air was alive with static. He felt each strand of copper like a nerve beneath his skin. 15 seconds. Weller shouted. Ash found the split wire, the one that had fused the main relay. He severed it clean with a snap of his cutters. Sparks flared, tiny stars bursting in the dark. He could feel the charge running across his knuckles, tingling alive. He stripped the auxiliary wire, twisted it tight, and looped it across the open contact. He reached for his grounding strap, but realized he'd lost it earlier in the smoke. He needed something else to complete the circuit, something conductive, something human. His eyes landed on the small wrench clipped to his belt. It wasn't ideal, it was dangerous, but it would work. He jammed one end of the wrench against the contact and held it steady with his gloved hand. His muscles tensed. Electricity hissed, searing the air. 10 seconds. He twisted the wrench slightly. The spark bridged. 5 seconds! He slammed the breaker back in. A blinding flash filled the cabin. The bomber lurched violently, engines coughing once, twice, then roaring back to life in perfect harmony. Ash was thrown backward, landing hard against the wall. The wrench clattered to the floor, smoking. Light returned, dim, flickering, but alive. Weller's voice burst through the intercom, clearer now. "Controls are stable! Altitude climbing! You did it, Ash!" Ash didn't answer. His hands shook violently. The smell of ozone and blood filled his nose. He looked down and saw a small burn mark across his palm where the current had passed through the glove. He smiled faintly. Yeah, she's alive. The crew cheered somewhere in the back, the kind of raw, disbelieving sound that only men facing death could make. But Ash didn't celebrate. He stayed seated on the cold metal floor, staring at the dancing instruments. The bomber flew steady again, but the lights flickered every few seconds, like a heartbeat faltering. It was holding, barely. He tilted his head back against the bulkhead, listening to the engines hum through the cold. Outside, dawn was breaking again, a thin orange glow seeping across the horizon, painting the edges of the world in light. He thought of something his instructor once said before the war, that machines are loyal creatures. Treat them right, and they'll do the impossible. Abuse them, and they'll kill you without a sound. Ash looked around the cabin, at the metal, the wires, the trembling bolts, and whispered softly, "Just hold together a little longer." But as he spoke, a faint crack sounded somewhere behind the main column, like the snapping of a thin branch under weight. He froze. His breath misted in the freezing air. What was that? The navigator asked. Ash turned slowly toward the sound. Another pop. Then a small, glowing ember fell from the ceiling. Drifting lazily down like a dying firefly, he knew that sound too well. A short, "Captain." Yeah, we're not out of it yet. Outside, the horizon filled with flak once more, black bursts climbing to meet them. The crew braced, engines straining. Ash looked at the glowing ember fade on the floor and felt a strange calm settle over him. The storm wasn't finished, and neither was he. He rose, tightening his gloves. Let's go again. And as the bomber plunged back into the firestorm ahead, his eyes burned with something brighter than fear, the quiet defiance of a man who refused to surrender to metal, to failure, or to fate itself. The morning sky was a bruised grey, torn by the last trails of smoke from flak bursts. The engines howled against the thin air, vibrating through the frame like a war drum. The bomber, blackened and limping, pressed forward into the storm, every bolt, every rivet holding on by faith and force. Ash crouched in the belly of the aircraft, his breath shallow and uneven. His fingertips were raw, the burns across his palm pulsing with heat. Around him, the smell of scorched metal mixed with the cold scent of high-altitude air leaking through the seams. He'd been working for what felt like hours, yet the clock said 30 minutes. The gauges flickered again, the patched circuits groaned under the strain. One by one, the lights across the board dimmed to embers. Weller's voice came through, rough but calm. "Ash, we're losing her again." Ash didn't move. His head rested against the cold wall, eyes half closed, thinking. "I know," he murmured. "I can hear it." There was a sound in the plane, not loud, but rhythmic. A faint stutter, like a heartbeat skipping every few seconds. Most would miss it. But to Ash, it was a language. He could tell exactly where the current was flowing, where it hesitated, where it died. He turned the flashlight back on, its beam slicing through smoke and dust. The copper veins of the aircraft glistened faintly, alive with dying energy. He followed them with his eyes, tracing each connection, each split, each pulse of resistance. In his mind, he rebuilt the machine from memory. Every fuse, every junction, every shared path between circuits. It unfolded like a map only he could see. The problem wasn't the patch, it wasn't even the wiring. It was the design itself, the way power fed in loops, interdependent, all pulling from the same source. The second one failed, everything failed. He thought of the manuals back at base. The ones written in neat ink by engineers who never smelled burning insulation at 10,000 feet. They'd never imagined this. They'd never seen a plane fight to stay alive like a wounded animal. He smiled faintly through the pain. "You're not built wrong," he whispered. "You're just too honest." He could fix it. He didn't know how yet, but he could feel the idea forming, a shape rising through chaos. The intercom sputtered again. "We're drifting off course," Weller said. "Navigators lost the stars. Compass is gone." Ash's reply came quiet, steady. "Then stay on heading by feel." "By feel?" "Yeah. The way a man walks home in the dark." Weller didn't argue. He knew better now than to question the tone in Ash's voice. The quiet certainty that somehow always found light in the dark. The bomber rattled as it hit another gust. Loose rivets sang against the frame. A red light flashed briefly on the console, generator overload. Then, as if tired of the struggle, it dimmed out completely. The engines sputtered once, twice. Then steadied again, but weaker. Ash's eyes sharpened. "She's bleeding power from the starboard generator," he said. "Can you cut it off? Not without killing both sides." There was a pause. Then Weller said quietly, "Do whatever you have to." Ash stared at the sparking conduit before him. The metal glowed faintly from heat. He reached for his toolbox, or what was left of it. Most of his instruments were bent, blackened, or gone. Only a few scraps remained: wire ends, a broken fuse clamp, a twisted spoon from the crew's mess kit. He picked up the spoon absently, rolling it between his fingers. Its surface reflected the weak light, dented and scarred. The curvature caught his eye, a natural arc, smooth and thin. He frowned, then froze. A thought hit him, small, ridiculous, impossible. Yet once it appeared, he couldn't unsee it. He set the spoon down beside the junction box and studied the shape again. The angle, the metal density, it could work. It could bridge the current without fusing shut. The spoon's concave face could disperse the charge, just enough to bypass the burned-out circuit. The logic was absurd but elegant. He tore another length of wire from the dead radio feed and stripped the insulation with his teeth. Then, with the smallest twist of copper and faith, he attached one end to the spoon's handle and the other to a live contact near the power bus. Sparks hissed softly, not angry, but curious, as if testing the idea themselves. "Come on," he whispered. "You've done stranger things." He lowered the spoon slowly until its edge kissed the open contact on the junction. The hum changed. A new tone filled the air, low, stable, different. Ash's breath caught. The voltmeter needle trembled, then rose. "Captain," he said into the intercom, "check your power levels." There was silence, then Weller's voice, quiet, disbelieving. "They're climbing. Stabilized, steady, just steady." Ash leaned back, staring at his crude creation, a spoon, a few inches of wire, and a desperate mind holding a 10-ton bomber in the sky. He almost laughed, but the sound came out like a sigh. The crew didn't understand what had just happened. They couldn't. But they could feel it, the machine breathing again, alive and obedient. The gunner's voice broke through. "Ash, what the hell did you do?" "Improvised," he replied. "You might want to keep your coffee cups. They're worth more than gold up here." Laughter rippled faintly through the intercom, nervous, exhausted, but real. In war, that was as close to joy as men could afford. Ash sat still for a long while, his eyes fixed on the glowing panel. The bomber flew steady now, slicing through the grey dawn like a bird stitched together by miracles. But beneath the relief was something deeper, a quiet awe. He wasn't just fixing machines anymore. He was rewriting them, teaching them new ways to live. The engines purred, the lights steadied, and for a fleeting moment, everything was calm. Yet inside him, the thought wouldn't rest. The spoon was a start, a whisper of something larger. If power could flow this way, rerouted and reborn, then maybe any failure could be undone with enough will. He stared at the metal beneath his fingers, feeling the faint vibration of current. It was no longer just electricity. It was life itself. Outside, the first edge of sunlight broke through the clouds, gilding the wings in gold. Ash closed his eyes and whispered to no one in particular. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're creating." The bomber flew on, the morning light catching the improvised circuit like a hidden jewel, glowing faintly in defiance of the impossible. The air inside the bomber had gone still. Even the engines seemed quieter now, their thunder replaced by a low, constant vibration that hummed through the floor, like the heartbeat of something reborn. Ash sat beneath the flickering light, staring at his improvised creation, the spoon glinting faintly in the half-dark. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't even safe. But it worked, and in war, that was enough to call something a miracle. The others didn't fully grasp what he'd done. They only knew that the aircraft, moments ago a falling coffin, now flew steady. The smell of burning metal lingered, but the fear had changed. It wasn't panic anymore, it was disbelief, wonder, the kind that made men fall silent. From the cockpit came Weller's voice, softer this time. "Aish, whatever that thing is, don't touch it again." Ash smiled faintly. I don't plan to. Good, because I think she likes it. He looked toward the forward windows, where the horizon stretched, endless and grey, the first thin gold of sunrise bleeding through. The bomber glided through it. Wounded but alive, carrying 9 men who suddenly believed the impossible could be reasoned with. Still, deep down, Ash knew the truth. This wasn't over. The fix wasn't permanent. The circuit could melt again at any moment, or the spoon could shift from vibration. But there was no time to think of that. Every second alive was borrowed time, and he was determined to spend it wisely. He reached for his notebook, a small grease-stained pad he always kept in his jacket. His fingers, still trembling, began to sketch. Not the spoon, but the circuit, the new pattern of flow, the idea that had just saved them. Lines crossed in chaotic beauty. Arcs of current rerouted through unfamiliar paths. He wrote without looking up, the plane trembling beneath him. It wasn't just a repair, it was a new way of thinking. Adaptive power logic, he'd call it later. A system that could rebuild itself mid-flight. For now, it was just survival turned into science. The intercom crackled softly. We're approaching the river, said the navigator. 15 minutes to target. Weller replied, Roger that. Keep her steady. Ash looked up. The target. He'd almost forgotten why they were here. Bombs still sat armed and ready in the bay below, silent reminders of their purpose. Yet something about the moment felt changed. The war around them, the endless destruction, seemed distant. Inside this steel shell, invention had replaced violence, if only for a breath. He closed his notebook. The spoon hummed faintly, warm from the steady current. He reached out, brushed it once with a fingertip, just to feel the life flowing through it. Electricity. The same force that lit cities, killed men, and now somehow kept hope airborne. A voice broke his thoughts, the rear gunner tense. Fighters! 6 o'clock, closing fast! The cabin erupted into movement. The engines screamed as Weller pushed the throttles forward. Ash grabbed the handrail, feeling the airframe lurch violently. Through the narrow window he saw them, 3 dark shapes slicing through the clouds, sunlight flashing off their wings.